Providence, late autumn. Pediatric resuscitation bay just before dawn. A motionless child lay pink and calm while the bedside monitor painted saw-toothed chaos. Oxygen saturation readouts dropped by 20 points, as the arterial sample later reported normal values within minutes. Risk management flagged the incident. A line in the chart appeared, blacked out in the official copy. When instruments argue, belief becomes dangerous. A quick note. If you appreciate careful, unsensational investigations like this, consider subscribing for more cases. I had been a pediatric emergency physician long enough to count seasons by the tone of the waiting room. Summer cracked with bicycle injuries and sunburned toddlers. Autumn carried coughs, first fevers, and the slow pressure of schoolyard viruses. On the night this case began, the air held that cold iron smell that crept in from the ambulance bay whenever the doors cycled. Our department in coastal New England handled everything from simple lacerations to the terrible minutes where hearts were restarted and families were prepared for news. A typical shift started with a brief pass-down from the outgoing team, a scan of the board, a mental triage of which rooms needed decisive movement and which needed time. I checked the one-page flow of criticals, glanced at staffing, and read the equipment board. Nothing unusual. A note mentioned flicker on a corridor camera. Engineering had logged it and cleared the power rail. I pocketed that fact without thinking. The child arrived, carried by a parent who looked less winded than wary. Age estimated at about 7 years. The triage nurse logged normal temperature, a pulse on the high side for a nervous child, and an oxygen saturation in the high 90s. Respirations even. The waiting room scent of hand sanitizer and damp coats followed them in. The only odd thing, noted later when I replayed my steps, was the clean, dry smell of heated dust that seemed to breathe from the monitor the moment it was turned on. The inciting observation came quickly. The pulse oximeter alarmed for desaturation into the 80s while the child sat upright, color robust, without the faintest lip duskiness. The waveform narrowed and trembled, unlike the classic saw that suggested poor perfusion. I swapped sites, ear to finger, then toe. I changed the probe. The alarm repeated, then stopped, then repeated again. Capnography, added as a simple nasal cannula trace because the child tolerated it, drifted toward 0 during quiet inhalations, then rebounded during exhalations in a pattern that argued with physiology. The smell of warmed dust sharpened during each alarm burst. I checked the vent above the bed. The filter looked newly replaced. I asked engineering to run a quick negative pressure check without naming a reason that would spook a family. Their gauge showed a steady draw. The nurse documented calmly. I wrote a brief note to capture the sequence, time-stamped and simple. Desaturation alarms, incongruent with exam. Child calm. Repositioned sensor. Pattern persisted. Capnography baseline drifted without clinical correlate. The first plan was entirely rational. I assumed movement artifact and sensor mismatch. The child's hands were small, cool, and fidgeting. I warmed a hand with a glove filled with tepid water, then repeated readings. I looked for nail polish or tiny adhesive residues. None. I thought of carbon monoxide, which in children could mask as flu with normal pulse oximetry that lied by physics. Here, the device trended low, not falsely high. I considered seizure activity, not the convulsive kind, but the quiet storms that move the autonomic nervous system and make monitors and skin disagree. The child stared into mid-space, unblinking, not fearful, and not engaged. A tiny muscle in the cheek trembled, then stopped. I filed that under maybe. We drew blood with minimal fuss. The lab tech labeled tubes, the printer clicked, the specimen cart trundled away. I ordered an arterial blood gas for clarity. I asked for a portable electroencephalography strip if the tech could roll in between other cases. I moved the child into isolation room 3 because it had the least electrical clutter on the shared circuit, an odd decision that I justified to myself as infection control prudence. Evidence came fast. The blood gas returned normal oxygen tension with a slightly low carbon dioxide that fit a child who had cried briefly and then stilled. The timing placed the sample about 5 minutes after an oxygen saturation dip into the 80s and a capnography baseline near 0. The numbers did not talk to one another. In my note, I captured the dissonance as plainly as I could. Blood gas within expected range, prior non-invasive values inconsistent, no clinical correlate of hypoxia. Plan to verify equipment in alternate bay. We moved the child one room over. The moment the monitors reset, the smell of heated dust returned. It seemed to come from the thin vents in the rear of the main screen, the same harmless scent that rises from a radiator that wakes in autumn. I logged the odor in the chart because patterns hide in details that feel trivial at the time. The counter-hypotheses lined up like an internal checklist. Device artifact, electromagnetic interference, a parent who soothed the child with an aerosolized remedy carrying volatile compounds that might confuse sensors, a neuro event that the body signaled through peripheral tone before the brainwave changed. I assigned each an experiment, swap the device, move the room, record an EEG strip with the room lights at half, watch the camera timestamps against the wall clock, ask the lab to run a co-oximetry panel to check for dyshemoglobins that fool optical sensors. When the EEG card arrived, the tech laid leads with practice speed. The child tolerated the net. The first minute printed clean alpha with a little theta that might fit sleeplessness. The next minute sketched a run of slower waves on the right side that could mean drowsiness or artifact from a shift of the cap. Then, during a long exhalation that fogged the cannula for a heartbeat, the capnograph sunk again while the pulse ox spiked. The EEG remained placid. The heated dust smell rose. I wrote that sentence nearly word for word later, surprised by how my memory glued scent to sequence. Institutional stakes surfaced quietly. A senior colleague, reviewing the board from his workstation, sent a message through the internal chat, reminding me to avoid speculative phrasing in any formal incident description. The suggestion arrived because engineering had already appended a note about corridor cameras capturing jitter in the timecode in this wing for the prior week. Our leadership, mindful of litigation, preferred clear cause or no cause, and anything in between lived inside sealed memos. I turned to audit my own thinking. The paradox of high alarm with normal skin and sound gas numbers demanded a better thread than chance. I checked the audit trail on the electronic chart, a simple habit learned the hard way, to confirm that no edits had appeared out of order. The log showed entries stacked as expected, then a strange sliver, a vitals import with a timestamp a few minutes in the future relative to the last manual entry. I screenshotted it to my private folder, then added a neutral line to the chart, asking information technology to review time synchronization in isolation room 3. By the end of that first hour, I had a child who seemed physically stable and a unit of data that refused to cohere. I had a recurring smell that laid itself over the worst moments like a transparent film. I had a set of counter-hypotheses matched to tests in flight. I had the sense of being watched by clocks that ticked at slightly different speeds. One of my own thinking with the least dramatic but most honest question. If the child's body was not failing, what system or systems around the child made it appear so, and could those same systems hide a real failure when it finally arrived? I began with the simplest way to break the pattern. I asked biomedical engineering for a transport monitor that could run on battery alone, and for a pulse oximeter from a different manufacturer. We moved the child to a corner bay on a separate electrical branch. The transport unit booted clean, battery icon full. For several quiet minutes, the traces looked ordinary. Then the capnography baseline crept downward during calm breathing, while the pulse oximeter flagged a fall in saturation. The child's skin stayed pink. The chest rose evenly. The radial pulse met my fingers with steady force. The heated dust smell rose again, faint at first, then distinct around the plastic housing of the new monitor. I logged the sequence in plain language and added that the scent returned with the alarm, even on battery power. To test the environment, engineering rolled in a handheld meter that sampled electromagnetic noise and line quality. They swept the room slowly while the child sat on the bed, legs dangling, hands still. The meter readings did not spike near outlets or the head wall. When the bed crossed the threshold into the hallway and back, the meter briefly jumped, then fell, then could not be made to repeat the jump with an empty bed. The engineer annotated their work order later, noting that transient noise appeared only with the child present. I copied the time marks into my note because the detail mattered. Readings elevated during a single pass with patient. Repeated passes without patient showed normal. I moved from the idea of bad equipment to the idea of contaminated measurement. We replaced every cable. We placed the oximeter on a pre-warmed toe. We taped the cannula so the prong sat just inside the nostrils without rubbing. We set the room lights to a steady level to avoid flicker. We asked the parent to keep personal electronics outside. Still, the same odd duet. The carbon dioxide line sank during exhalation, then rose when it should have dipped. The saturation number pretended to fall while the waveform thinned as if the light path had turned to water. I lifted my head to the ceiling diffuser, wondering if warm air currents could cause mixed readings. The air felt neutral on my skin. The heated dust smell lingered all the same, strongest at the back of the monitor where the fan expelled a thread of warmth. Rational medicine lives by replication in new conditions. We took the child to radiology for a scan that used a separate monitoring system and a shielded room. If stray fields or a dirty power rail were to blame, the contradiction should have died inside that cage. It did not. During the machine warm-up, a soft whir pushed a warm breath through the gantry, and with it came the same faint scent of heated dust. The saturation value dipped again while the child lay still. The capnography line wavered toward flat, then returned. A blood gas drawn just before transport returned from the lab with normal oxygen and a slightly lowered carbon dioxide, a result that fit the earlier crying and stillness but did not fit the flat line that the capnograph pretended to show. I wrote that the shielded environment failed to extinguish the pattern. I needed a ledger of precedent. Between cases, I queried our incident system for pediatric flags that paired physiologic alarms with notes about normal exam. 2 entries appeared from the same wing over the prior cold season. One described desaturation alarms that resolved when the child was left undisturbed, but recurred when staff approached, with color normal throughout. Another noted a smell described as warm plastic near a monitor housing during repeated false alarms. Neither case carried a unifying explanation. Neither named the heated dust scent the way my mind had fixed on it, but the hints rhymed. I added those case numbers to my private file and summarized them, in the chart as prior similar events within the unit. Colleagues weighed in through the workday without fanfare. One reminded me, through the internal channel, to guard against bias from pattern matching, especially with a child whose presentation could hide a rare seizure type. Another suggested a clean co-oximetry panel to rule out unusual hemoglobin states that could twist saturation readings under certain light conditions. Pharmacy added that certain over-the-counter decongestants could lift heart rate and narrow pleth waveforms enough to mislead the oximeter, even when the child looked well. None of this carried drama. It all carried care. We sent blood to check for carbon monoxide and methemoglobin. We sent urine to screen for stimulants and anticholinergics. Results returned in the normal range. The electronic chart's audit trail showed orderly entries except for the same small oddity I had seen earlier. A vital set imported with a clock that ran a few minutes ahead of the most recent manual note. Information technology replied later that time synchronization in that wing had shown occasional drift for corridor cameras over the prior week, but that device clock should not have been affected. I updated my note to reflect that finding. Known video time drift, uncertain effect on bedside devices. If I could not make the anomaly vanish, I would try to pin it to a trigger. We ran a stillness test. With the child settled and eyes half closed, we left the room quiet. For long minutes, nothing moved but the chest and the paper sweep. The traces smoothed. Then a soft mechanical click came from above the ceiling tile, the sort of small sound a damper makes when a building adjusts to a temperature schedule. A thin thread of warmer air brushed my forearm. The heated dust smell returned, paired with a small drop in saturation and a capnography sag. I wrote that down without leaping to meaning. Air handler's cycle appeared to precede renewed artifact, correlation not proven. To break the correlation, engineering temporarily set the air handler for that room to a constant flow. The small clicks stopped. The room held a steady, cool wash. For a time, the traces behaved. I began to think the simplest story might carry it. A microclimate along the cannula path, heat pooling near sensors, air movement tricking the light path. Then the strongest contradiction of the day arrived. Without any sound from the ceiling and with the air steady on my skin, the capnography line fell to near flat, while the child's chest rose on a measured rhythm. The oximeter cried low while the pulse under my fingers stayed warm and full. The heated dust smell pushed against my mask again, even with the air handler pinned. Whatever had anchored the scent to the air cycle broke loose in that moment, or my mind had been too eager to tie them together. Ethical pressure followed the physiological pressure. A child sat in a hospital room while a team tested wires and vents. 3. Parent wanted a plan that sounded like care, not experiment. Admission without a name would expose the family to cost and stress. Discharge without clarity would open the door to a real event at home, under the shadow of our uncertainty. I explained, without speculation, that we were observing contradictions and that we would keep the child until the data aligned with the exam. I wrote a version of that same sentence into the chart so the plan lived in the record. We tried a human factors control. A sitter with calm presence took the room while the rest of us watched from the glass. The sitter's task was simple. Remain still, record the time whenever any scent or sound changed, and note the child's visible state. For a graceful stretch, nothing happened. Then the sitter raised a hand to mark a change. The monitor alarmed a breath later. The sitter recorded a faint odor of warmed dust before the alarm, not after. That ordering mattered. In my note, I captured it exactly as a sequence without interpretation. Scent perceived by observer. Shortly after, device alarm, child unchanged. I still entertained the most uncomfortable branch of the tree, manipulation. We had asked the parent to step out during some of these segments. The pattern survived their absence. We had checked the child's clothing and blanket for embedded electronics or heat patches with consent and care. We found none. A toy car with a small friction motor sat on the windowsill. Its back axle warmed slightly after a quick spin, but the effect was trivial and reproducible only when spun near a sensor, which we had not seen at the times of the alarms. I did not cross this possibility off the list. I lowered its rank. By late evening, the unit had the crowded weight of a weekend. Through that pressure came the pivotal event that should have broken the pattern for good. The child developed a low fever, the sort that often follows a day of stress and tears, and dozed. A gentle monitor attached to the toe reported a steady oxygen number. The capnograph drew a small wave with each breath. Then, the cardiac monitor displayed a rhythm that, in any other context, would have triggered a resuscitation page. The child's face remained peaceful. The chest rose. The pulse under my fingers carried on. The smell of heated dust surged so strongly that even staff outside the room later mentioned it in their brief notes. I stood with one hand on the cart and the other on the child's ankle, feeling that the next action would either expose a fatal passivity or reveal an error in our rules. The decision point forced a protocol choice. If the monitor was right, we would deliver a shock to a child whose body looked and felt stable. If the monitor was wrong, we would harm a stable child with a dangerous intervention. The algorithm in my head split the difference by demanding a second, independent confirmation. We clipped a second sensor from a sealed package, untouched by prior hands, to a different limb, and ran the transport monitor on battery. Screen brightness low, alarms silenced until confirmed. The lethal rhythm persisted on the first screen, while the second screen showed a rhythm that matched the pulse I felt. The capnography argued with itself across two channels. The air above the monitors felt warm and dry. The smell of heated dust thickened like a presence, not overwhelming, but certain. At that same moment, the room clock and the corridor clock parted, accompanied by a margin that any passerby could see. The corridor clock ticked forward in even steps. The room clock hesitated, then leaped, then lagged. Information technology later reported that the building's central time source had not dropped. Power logs recorded that the branch serving that room stayed within tolerance. The electronic record showed a normal sequence of orders and notes across that minute. Only the eyes in that space carried the memory of a stutter in time. I ended that long day with the belief system I had trained into myself straining at its hinges. I had tried to falsify through equipment, location, and human control. I had found partial fits and clean failures. I had seen the heated dust motif behave like a telltale and then betray that role. I had arrived at a moment where an algorithm would have ordered a life-altering act if I had trusted one screen over another. The child slept. The monitors glowed. The air felt as if a furnace somewhere had woken in the walls. I wrote the only safe plan I could defend: continue observation under manual primacy, escalate only with clear clinical change, and rebuild the measurement stack from the wall outward by morning. Then the radiology team paged that an overnight slot had opened for a more detailed study that required continuous monitoring by policy. The clash between manual primacy and monitoring requirement landed on my desk. I stepped toward the threshold, one foot in a room where numbers had become unreliable, the other in a system that insisted those same numbers guide the next move. Radiology required continuous monitoring. Policy did not bend for a hunch, so I rebuilt our plan around redundancy that did not depend on the wall. We used 2 transport monitors from different makers, each on battery. We added a simple manual pulse oximeter that displayed only a colored bar and a soft tone, nothing more. We placed a capnography line that fed both units through a split designed to prevent feedback. A respiratory therapist stood at the head of the bed with a stethoscope and a watch that wound by hand. Security positioned a portable camera on its own power pack. stamped by a time source that did not talk to the hospital network. I noted each layer in the chart as a stack. 2 independent devices, a third minimal indicator, a human ear and hand, and a camera with an island clock. The child dozed as we moved down the hall. The air in radiology always carried a cool, metallic stillness, as if the space had been kept in winter even in summer. The table warmed where a small heater kept patients from shivering. The therapist guided the cannula past the child's cheek, careful to avoid drafts from the gantry. For a brief span, the screens were calm. Between breaths, the colored bar on the manual device rose and fell with a lazy regularity. I wrote that quiet into my memory because it gave contrast. The first break happened just after the scans warm up. A faint whir bloomed from the machine as internal fans spun. A narrow breath of warmer air slid past my sleeves. The smell of heated dust crept in, not strong but distinct, as if a radiator somewhere far away had opened its eyes. At nearly the same instant, one transport monitor flagged a fall in saturation, while the other held steady. The capnography trace feeding both units dropped toward a line that suggested no exhaled carbon dioxide. The child's chest rose and fell. The therapist counted silently by her watch and marked each rise with a finger touch. The manual bar lingered in the mid-range, unruffled. I pressed fingers to the dorsalis pedis pulse. It met me, warm and even. I did not announce an interpretation. I wrote the order of events in plain sequence as I saw them. Warm air, scent, divergence of saturation between devices, shared capnography sag, stable chest rise, steady pulse under hand, manual indicator unchanged. The camera's island clock would later confirm the overlaps by its own record. We needed a blood anchor in the moment of contradiction, not after. A nurse had set a line earlier for that purpose. I asked for a draw during the sag. The sample left the room in a labeled syringe. By policy, a runner took it to the closest blood gas machine, not sharing our wing's power. The result returned while the monitors still disagreed. It showed oxygen and carbon dioxide in ranges that matched a lightly sleeping child. In the chart, I paired the time of that result, as words, not digits, to the camera's clock stamp and to the minute hand on the analog watch. 3 sources told the same story. The body's gases did not line up with the capnography's near flat line. If interference was the heart of this, it persisted in places designed to exclude it. If physiology was the heart of this, it left almost no trace in measures that should have carried the fingerprints. I felt my model flex and hold. The scan proceeded through standard sequences. Between sets, the machine idled, fans cycling down. The smell thinned and the traces calmed. When the machine accelerated again, the scent returned like a shadow. I remembered the ceiling damper clicks from earlier, the way I had wanted the air handler to be the villain. Here, the air came from a different source with different power and a new path, yet the same odor rode the same moments of change. I wrote that correlation and added a caution beside it. Association noted across 2 spaces and 2 systems. Mechanism unknown. A second draw during a later SIG mirrored the first. Normal oxygen tension, low normal carbon dioxide. 2 independent devices still disagreed about saturation. The manual bar still drifted in the middle, untroubled. The therapist's notes recorded chest sounds that remained clear. The camera watched an uneventful rise and fall. The radiology console captured its own log of fan cycles and table warmers. Later, when information technology extracted that file, the timestamps lined up with our camera for most of the hour. In one small window, they did not. The console clock hesitated and then caught up by a handful of seconds. The island camera marched on without a hitch. I wrote that discrepancy into the case summary because time itself had become one of the instruments. The pivotal chain came near the end of the study. The main transport monitor shifted to a rhythm that would have triggered an immediate resuscitation page if taken at face value. Its partner showed a steady pattern. The capnography on both units went flat. The manual bar held stubbornly in the middle. The therapist's hand stayed on the child's sternum, feeling a calm rise. My own fingers kept the pulse at the ankle. The smell of heated dust thickened enough that it crossed the threshold from faint to obvious. Staff outside the line of sight later recorded noting it in their own words, unprompted, as a warm, dry, slightly metallic scent that accompanied what they heard as alarms muffled by the doorway. I ordered no shock. I documented the ground on which I stood. 2 independent screens did not match. A manual indicator and 2 sets of hands matched one another and contradicted one screen. A blood gas a short time before and another a short time after bracketed the moment with values that did not fit the lethal story. A camera watched the chest rise while clocks within the digital stack showed microslips without tournament rules that named a champion. The study ended. The child woke and asked for water. The face was pink. The lips had never gone blue. The toes were warm. I felt both relief and the sharp awareness that relief here did not prove the choice. It only marked the outcome. I wrote that thought into my own notes because humility needed a place in the record. The aftermath unfolded in policy, not myth. Our department wrote a memo that placed manual primacy into a clear order of operations for any pediatric case in which non-invasive devices and exam split. A second independent device had to agree before a life-changing intervention based on numbers alone. Continuous capnography could not be the sole arbiter of ventilation without a corroborating measure when the body told a different story. We added a simple instruction to record sense and microclimate cues when chalking the timeline, because the heated dust motif had become, for us, a time marker as real as a beep. Facilities widened their maintenance log to include fan cycles, table warmers, and local heaters in rooms where alarms. Clustered information technology added a periodic cross-check of time sources in radiology and in the pediatric wing, comparing wall clocks, device clocks, and the island camera's internal heart. I changed in smaller ways. I stepped back from screens for a count of slow breaths before I decided in a crisis. I asked for a second look from a colleague even when I believed I was right and time was short. I kept a mental list of scents and sounds that rooms kept for themselves. I learned the signature of heated dust in each bay, how new it smelled in early autumn, and how it faded by midwinter. I began to see that devices capture only what they are designed to see, and that rooms teach them to lie in repeatable ways. The counter-hypotheses did not die. They found their size. Seizure as a cause held less weight after clean electroencephalography during the worst contradictions. Rare toxins retreated when blood and urine stayed bland. Decimoglobins left when co-oximetry read standard. Electromagnetic interference remained on the board because the phenomenon behaved like fields in ways that did not map cleanly to our wiring diagrams. Airflow tricks stayed because the scent paired with temperature change again and again, even when the path of air shifted. Human manipulation remained least likely given how the pattern ran in rooms and contexts where hands were kept still and pockets were checked. Yet I never dismissed it entirely, because certainty in emergency work is a luxury and a risk. If the phenomenon were true in the strongest sense, an interaction between specific children and the measurement stack that created false danger, then our reliance on particular algorithms needed pruning. Protocols would have to insist on cross-confirmation across different kinds of sensing, not just across different instances of the same kind. If the phenomenon were artifact born of rooms and circuits alone, with no special role for the child, then the fix lay in engineering and procurement. That path would be slower and less glamorous but more honest. In either case, our job became the same: act in ways that protected a child from both disease and our own misreadings. Months later, during the first cold snap of a new autumn, I walked into the pediatric wing early for a dawn shift. The air had that familiar metallic bite. A heater somewhere had woken. I passed isolation room 3 and glanced in. A biomedical engineer sat with the back panel of a monitor open on the cart. A neat array of dust caught on a wipe beside the fan. No alarms screamed. The room smelled clean. The engineer later wrote a maintenance note that the fan assembly had been replaced after it failed a bench test for minor voltage ripple under load. A ripple too small to trigger a simple fault, but enough to jitter a sensitive sensor when paired with a certain air pattern. The note did not explain the time slips or the difference between two independent monitors under the same roof. It did not need to. It marked one piece of the field where we had walked. I will not call the child demonic. I will not pretend that a smell carried malice. I will say that a body and a building, a policy and a set of screens met in a way that made action dangerous and inaction dangerous, and that we built a careful bridge across that space. The final image I keep is simple: the colored bar on the manual device rising and falling in a calm arc while numbers argued, and a thin ribbon of warm air carrying the scent of heated dust past my sleeves as clocks disagreed and a child's chest moved under a sleeping hand. When numbers and body disagree in a child, and protocols demand an act that your senses deny, how many independent confirmations must you require before you cross from watching to doing?